thank you for coming out. I'd like to congratulate you on not being in Las Vegas right this moment, which is where I could be, and honestly, Lansing seems like a much better bet. Nothing personal, Las Vegas. Your timing is perfect.
Just on it.
Yeah.
So I am here from LaunchDarkly, and we're going to talk about feature flags. But before we do that, I thought I would get a little reading on what it is that you want to hear about, because there are a few enough of us that we can sort of get a read of the room. Like, do you know what I mean when I say feature flag? Are you actually looking for implementation details or stories about how people do it? Are you looking for best practices and how to do naming or thinking about it? What is it that I can bring you from the world of feature flags? You know, I'm working on a better name. We say feature management. I think that's not descriptive enough, but feature flags is a big tool with a lot of different use patterns. So there's a lot of different ways we can talk about it. So give me a little bit about what you were hoping to get tonight. I mean, besides me.
I mean, I'm interested in best practices, and I come from a development background, so I'm kind of probably more interested in the nitty-gritty details. LaunchDarkly, but kind of promoting this idea of curious in the more.
Okay.
I'd like to see along those lines kind of the development pattern. So when we talk about trying to do this without having to start from scratch and reinvent it ourselves, there's got to be a good established best practice pattern, I would think. So.
And I've heard a few of your colleagues talk before, and the things that I always get a lot of value out of are some of the gotchas, you know, the unexpected cost of, you know, missteps, and then some of the more unique use cases that you might not think of for leveraging something like feature management, feature toggle.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I guess I'm interested from the novice perspective all the way to advanced. So turning features on and off, maybe the whole concept of there are no more branches anymore. There's no concept of dev, test, staging, or prod. It's all a matter of turning feature flags on and off. You know, how does that work? How do you get an idea of what you're testing against? Things like that. But
We're all testing in production. Some of us admit it.
Yeah.
Okay, that gives me a good idea of where we're going to go. Excellent, thank you. You were working earlier. There we go. So, why do we use feature flags? I tore apart the deck that my sales team uses to do this because I didn't feel satisfied that we'd answered this core question of like, why you would even want to do this. Because what I'm asking you to do is inject a behavior into your code during runtime. I mean, you inject it, I'm not doing it. I'm not touching your code. But what you're saying is, this code is Schrodinger's code. It could behave in a number of different ways after I've deployed it. It's kind of scary. If you're a person who's used to having control of how things behave, it seems really scary to say that. And not only like you can control how the code operates, but like sales can control how the code operates. Tech support can control how the code operates. So why would you want to do this? And the more I think about why, the more I think about how painful it is to do deployment. Even those of us who are doing multiple deploys a day are still aware that if we do a deployment that's sort of out of band or unusual or stressed, there's every chance that something's going to go wrong. If you do this with feature flags instead, you are literally just changing the behavior of a rule set. You're not pushing any new code, you're not taking any code out. You're just changing how the rule set evaluates. And that gives you a lot more safety and flexibility and speed compared to deploying. So deployment is not the same as release. This is a super important concept for all feature flags. Deployment is the act of getting your code to where it needs to be. That might be code, like infrastructure as code is still getting your code to where it needs to be. It might be other kinds of code that you want to have out of end users. It might be APIs, whatever it is. You need to get it out there. That's the sort of internal, what we do every day is get code out. Release is where we find the business value. Release is the moment that it starts to make money or save money. Release is not necessarily a DevOps problem. Might be a business problem, might be a sales problem, might be a support problem, might be a DevOps problem. But once we can decouple those things in our head and say, look, the code is up and it's ready to go. When you're ready for it, turn it on. I've moved on to the next thing. That gives us a lot more flexibility about how fast we can move, because now we're not like tied up waiting for this one big tax day deadline and nothing can happen until Black Friday is over. When they want Black Friday to happen, we've already done it and tested it. It's ready to go. Go faster, be safer. Have you read Accelerate? Yes, yes, yes. If you haven't yet, this is a book you need to go out and read. It's by Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble and Gene Kim. And you really only need to read the first third of it. It's all good, but the first third is the meat. The second third is the math, and the last third is the business case. The first third says, the reason that we're scared of deployment is because things go wrong. And then we sort of get uptight about doing a release, and we wait until we're sure it's perfect, and then more things get added to it so that the risk of breakage is higher. And the way I think of this is, if you ever taught a kid to ride a bike, it is the most illogical thing ever. This part of the talk doesn't work in Europe, where they teach kids on Strider bikes. It's much more humane. But we take a kid, and we say, I'm going to fling you at the pavement on this wheeled machine of death. If you pedal fast enough, you won't fall down. And a kid who does not know from physics or bike riding is like, that makes no sense. Why would going faster mean I don't fall down? Pretty sure the pavement is hard. I've covered that one already. And faster is usually more painful. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I feel like a lot of us are in that place where we're like, it doesn't make sense to me that going faster would be safer. But it means that we have very small deltas. And so if something goes wrong, we have time to correct it, instead of it being an enormous release and an enormous rollback. I'm getting a new clicker. It's going to be great. Oh, now I've angered it. So LaunchDarkly has some features that let you go faster and be safer, but I will tell you, there are several people in the feature management space who are doing things that are sort of similar. Their architecture style is a little different, their approach is different. We were just talking about the fact that it's reInvent, and AWS announced that they have a thing that allows you to do, A/B testing and targeted testing, which is just elaborate load balancing. But that's okay, it's still in the same concept area. We're giving you control over who controls the flags. This is really useful when we go talk to people who have regulated industries. So there's audit logs and there's controls, and only these people can affect how things are working in production. We're giving you audit logs and debugging, and the chance to see what's happening, and also have it stored someplace that's off-site, which again, regulated industries really prefer to have their logs on that stored off-site. I will digress and say one of the coolest use cases I've seen for multivariate flags, because we do Booleans as a service, but we also do multivariate as a service. You can have all of your log settings as a flag. So 1 to 7, right? And most of the time you run along at log level 1 or 2, not reporting much back, everything's going fine. Something goes wrong. Your telemetry starts to tell you that something's going wrong, but your log level isn't high enough to detect what it is. Now, you have this problem where if you reboot whatever system is failing to change the log level, you might cause that error to go away temporarily. It will be back, it will. But if you have it behind a feature flag, the log level, you could just say, hey, turn this log level up to 7. I want it reporting everything. And you never have to redeploy, and you never have to restart. It just starts reporting the higher level of logging data, because that code was already there, just wasn't in use. Tagging is something that we've added to deal with the fact that there are people out there who have thousands and thousands of feature flags. in their organizations. And we made them semantically aware so that you can say this only applies to things that are 4.2 and above. We made them apply to security groups, so you can say only administrators can see this tag. We made them apply to project names, and so that you could say, like, you can only see the flags that belong to your project group. That gives us a lot of dimensionality in understanding and seeing what we're doing. And we have user segmentation. I'm going to have a discussion with my engineers at some point about the fact that we put in a bunch of sample data that it's easy for people to sort on, that is actually kind of destructive to how you want to do targeting. Like, we say, hey, would you like to sort on people's email addresses? Which seems fine in a pre-GDPR world. But if you're sorting on people's email addresses, you're storing people's email addresses, it's not ideal. So like, it's sort of a default that we built in because we're like, hey, it would be cool to do this. In production, very few people actually want to sort on email address. This is a picture of what our dashboard looks like, and it is super friendly because we want everybody to be able to turn things on and off, whether or not they coded it. And when you drill down, there's like a whole bunch of rules about how to do targeting and how to figure out where things are going. But at the top level, we want you to be able to see if something is on or off and what it does. And we'll get into that a lot more. So, what does feature management do? One tool, many, many, many patterns. I put together a page called featureflag.io, and it has just a list of all of the patterns I've seen. So circuit breakers. So say you're consuming a data stream into your database, the API is feeding you stuff. All of a sudden, traffic spikes 100x, right? This happens. Somebody gets spammed, somebody gets a botnet. Bad crap is flowing into your database. What you'd like to be able to do is have whatever noticed that spike turn off the inbound and then page you. You could use a feature flag on the pipe to turn it off. And then say, okay, let's go figure out why we had this sudden spike in traffic. Like maybe it was legit. Maybe we just did a promotion and nobody told us about it. It could be. But it gives you the chance to react before a bunch of garbage gets written into your database. Another one that I really enjoy is what we call the albatross. So there's the canary, right, where you let people in early to try out new features and sort of road test them a little bit before you let them out fully. But there's also the albatross. This is where you have the client who pays you a lot of money and is also never ever getting rid of Silverlight. You don't want anyone else to know that you're supporting Silverlight, but you have to support Silverlight because it's a lot of money. And so you put them behind a flag that sees a modern product and they get the thing that they still need to operate. You're sort of dragging them behind. We've seen people tie being in the Canary group, in the Champagne Brunch group, somebody called it, to your Net Promoter Score. So if your company's Net Promoter Score, if you are really excited about this product, you get sorted into the people who get the new features first. So it's like this virtuous cycle of people who are excited about the product get to see the new features first and get excited about them and road test them, as opposed to sort of inflicting them on people who are like, you moved my cheese. Again, I don't like it when my cheese moves. You moved my cheese. So it allows you to do a bunch of different patterns. There's ops patterns about doing backups, about doing circuit breakers, about doing load balancing, about doing failovers. There's also like UX things, blue or green. You know, there's a database conversion. Instead of doing an abrupt cutover, again, blue to green, you could do sort of a teal conversion where you have both states of the database and the difference is managed by flags instead of by having separate databases. And then when you're confident that everything is writing correctly, you can shut off the old field and leave the new field intact without doing anything destructive to your schema. It's pretty cool, huh? I really love how many different ways there are to use this. And every time I go talk to a customer, they come up with something new. I was in Australia last month, and we had this extended discussion about gambling machines. There's a lot of gambling in Australia. And they were like, how do you deal with the fact that we have these basically IoT devices, and we can have the code ready to go, but it still has to pass the audit system, which takes 3 months. But we want to ship them before that. I'm like, well, you can have your code, and assuming it's going to pass audit, then you can just switch it on once it's passed audit, instead of having to push it through, Australia has terrible internet, through the terrible rural Australian internet. It already exists on the device. It's pretty cool. Sneakernet. So, LaunchDarkly has this concept of projects and environments, and I think it's super useful to think about because of the QA, test, development, production environment mentality that a lot of us have. We have those because we've learned that it's a bad idea to let developers push things directly to where people can see them. It's not actually a bad idea to have them push to production, because your test environment is a lie. Your test environment is not actually what production looks like. Almost nobody has enough money to replicate the full weirdness, the true licensing, the depth of third-party usage that production has. We're doing sort of if you squint, it looks like production, right? Or we could do it with feature flags and actually pay testing in production without showing it to users. And I'm not saying we should ever get rid of testing. Testing is super important. Maybe staging is not as important as we think it is. Maybe staging is a security blanket, and sometimes we could put it in the wash and see if we can run without it. So here is, on LaunchDarkly, here are the environments. And this is, it would be like a top-level team or project, right? So it would be like the mobile group, the desktop group, right? So there's the main account, the person or people who have the license access, essentially, the project, and each of the projects can have environments. So they might have dev, test, and prod in each of them, but these could actually be the same code base. They might not. Like, it might be that there's so much divergence between desktop and mobile that it doesn't make sense to keep them in the same place, but there's a lot of overlap sometimes. So if you're doing that, why not just keep it all in one place and branch by abstraction by using feature flags? That way you get all of the power of having your stuff located in the same place so that you're all talking about the same thing at the same time, instead of trying to port features over from one project to another project. We've all been on those projects where they're like, okay, so let's make it work for Java now. All right, let's talk about naming conventions, because this is a really important part of feature flags, and it's so easy to get it wrong and it's so hard to fix. So nobody has ever named anything like that, because that wouldn't be very helpful, would it? These are all actual things that we pulled out of our client databases and some of our own. Do a thing was one of my favorites. It was actually from our sales demo environment, and it turned on like a blink. So the do a thing flag sure did a thing. It made the whole site blink. Yeah. So none of these features are very useful because they don't actually tell you what's going to happen. The other thing that we've learned, and this is super important, don't say in the flag name on or off. Because if you turn the sales feature on flag off, is it off or is it on? It leads to a lot of confusion. So like this is a real, just don't, off and on are forbidden from your vocabulary for how you name these things. You'll thank me later. Or you won't, because you'll never notice it was going to be a problem. So, flag keys are the name that the flag knows itself by, that you search for it by. It's the canonical code name. And tags are the other sort of metadata about what the flag is. Who belongs to it, what it belongs to, which projects it's in. Flag keys are meaningful and searchable and aligned to internal standards. When you start doing a flagging project, add flag naming conventions to your code. Thank you. Book of, no, not your pipeline, your standards. I mean, you should add them to your pipeline, but like, let's start with style guide. There we go. Add it to your style guide and say like people trip up over the weirdest things. Are we doing camel case or are we doing snake case? Like, this is an important thing to agree on, because if you think it's one thing and I think it's the other, we could both code in something that ostensibly has the same name and doesn't. LaunchDarkly, like most computer systems, is case sensitive. Tags are a conjunction substitution, so you can say like this for that. They could map to the org chart, so they say like this is the DevOps group, this is the sales group, and you can create them either through the API or through the UI, that friendly front end I showed you. The front end is entirely driven by the API. The API is entirely accessible to people who have a key, a license key. There's nothing that you can do on the front end that you can't do with the API, and a few things you can do with the API that you can't do with the front end. And leaving that all exposed gives you the levers to do a lot of automation that we think is very valuable. So if you want to do a progressive deployment, if you want to say like, I want to roll out 5% an hour, okay, that's a thing that you would automate with like a cron job. Maybe not a cron job, but you know, something like that. And so we've left all of these levers exposed so that you can build it into your pipeline and your system and make it yours. So here are general examples of pretty useful flags, like persist audit log version number. I know what's going to happen when I say turn that on. I do want it to persist. If I turn it off, I do not want it to persist. All right? Search minimum characters, same thing. I know what happens if it's turned on. These names are tagged by where they expect to be. So where's the environment and how are they going to behave? So how does it work? There are two different how does it work explanations. Let's talk about the architecture first. LaunchDarkly is absolutely something that you could build 60% of in a couple weeks. We know that. The other 40% is super complicated, and it involves a lot of contracts with people who serve the internet, who make sure your stuff is going to be there reliably. And that's the thing that I really want to emphasize when we're talking about architecture is we're here to make sure your code behaves the way you expect it. It takes about 200 milliseconds to propagate a flag update. So when you want to make a change, we're going to push that down in under a second, assuming that you have some kind of internet access that allows for that. It's a little different on mobile, depending on, well, if you work in mobile, you know. But give or take. People ask me how long it takes to evaluate a flag, and the answer is as long as it takes to serve whatever you're serving. Because all of the data, like I said, the code is already there. Schrodinger's code is already on whatever is serving. All we're doing is changing how the rule set is evaluated. And it's a very fast push and it has very little data. But when it's just running along and nothing has changed, that's just how it believes the code works. It doesn't see anything else. It's not calling back home to find out what the flag state is. It just knows that. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay.
So where is it storing the actual flags locally?
There's an SDK.
Okay. Those sound like some key value storage like that is something proprietary.
Let me think about how to answer that, sorry. It is not a key value pair exactly, it is a rule set. So it is still evaluating whether somebody gets that variant.
Those sound like a zookeeper, counselor, SCPs.
No, those are larger grained.
Okay.
This one, like these flags could be that large, but they could also be down to the individual level, and they could have multiple flags that apply to them. So if you wanted to serve something that only applied to Spanish speakers over 70 in Central Florida, you would have 3 separate flags that had like an age, a language, and a geo. And only if somebody met all 3 criteria would they get that variant.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It will.
It will, probably. We'll see. Last time I checked, we're serving about 400 billion flags a day. That's actually an undercount because we're doing sampling on some of our biggest customers like Atlassian. Yeah, if you use Atlassian, you rely on LaunchDarkly to continue working every day. So here are a few key components of the external services. So there's the app.launchdarkly.com, that's the pretty UI. So that's the web application and the REST API. There's events.launchdarkly.com, that's the analytics events sync. So you can connect that to whatever you're using for analytics. We have some lightweight analytics of our own, but mostly we find people who care a lot about analytics already have an engine that does that. We didn't spend a ton of time on that. We're not using Firehose as much anymore, which is a pity. I really loved like the idea of drinking from the fire hose. We had sample data, and then there was like, oh, well, we need the fire hose. And then the flag stream is stream.launchdarkly.com or client, depending on how you're hitting it, like whether you have a server-side or a client-side system. So here's how they interact together. I'm hoping this is a way to answer your question. The server SDKs and client SDKs feed out to events.launchdarkly. So that's like, here's what we did, right? These SDKs, here's what we did. Here's how we know what to do. And then Fastly helps us make sure that we're getting sufficient throughput and basically edge service. So we're making sure that you don't have to come all the way back to LaunchDarkly. You could just hit your Fastly CDN, which is probably much closer to you. And that reduces the latency again. Our current project is called Streamers Around the World, and it's basically making sure that we have CDN support in all the parts of the world so that we can be fast everywhere. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. So, quick explanation of polling versus streaming. LaunchDarkly is a streaming push, we're not supposed to say push, but really it's a push-based system. Everything ticks along fine until you make a change, at which point we shove that information down to the place that it needs to be. It means that the only time your client needs to call home is when it instantiates. It wakes up and it says, hello, I would like to know how I'm going to serve this web page. I will go ask LaunchDarkly and get the rules. And that isn't like necessarily a per page, it depends on how you have it set up, but it happens from your server. Client and server have become terms that are very deeply stacked. It's difficult to tell what we're talking about at any given moment, but what we're saying is mostly you're not calling home. You're not calling back to LaunchDarkly. For a polling, what's happening is, hey, I want to evaluate this. What's the setting? Here's the setting. What's the setting? Here's the setting. It's a lot noisier and has a lot more round trips, which is especially difficult if you're dealing with something that is data restricted in some way. We have a lot of interesting handheld mobile device things. We have some IoT customers who are like, we don't want to be spamming somebody's network all the time to find out if there's any changes. So we're using server-sent events that say, here's the instantiation. Where am I? What am I doing? And then new data, push down. New data, push down. That's all. And then, of course, the analytics are feeding back, but that's not critical in the same way to the behavior of the app for your client. So I'm actually, let's see. So the payload for server-side SDKs is a little larger, as the server is a trusted environment and has all of the flag values delivered. So servers need to have all of the variations available for whatever user comes in. The client payload is much more narrowly focused on what is likely to be applicable to that client. So we're not going to push down things that are not relevant to that client's needs, because we don't want to consume a ton of space and data for something that isn't ever going to be used. So the payloads differ a little bit depending on where the SDK is sitting. So client initialization, here's your server. Here's the SDK. It says, hey, LaunchDarkly, tell me what I'm doing. Okay, here are the rules. I'm going to send them to you and to the CDN. That way the CDN knows and you know in case anything goes wrong. Okay, I hit a condition that has caused a variation. Like this is not the standard, this is the new variant. I'm trying the B version, right? Well, okay, I'm going to go hit the CDN and get the new rule. Or hit the server and get the new rule. If I need to, I'll go back up to the CDN. If I can't get it from the CDN, I'll go back up to LaunchDarkly. But most of the time, it's going to be right there locally. And then the SDK returns the flag values. I feel like I covered this part already. So failure modes. What if LaunchDarkly is down? This doesn't happen very often, but nobody's perfect. Outages happen. We're in Oakland. I suppose we could fall into the ocean. A lot of Amazon would also have to fall into the ocean, but that also happens once in a while. So if that happens, you still have your local copy and your CDN copy. You still have all the cached things. The thing that happens the second after LaunchDarkly vanishes from the earth is the same thing that happened the second before. Nothing changes. You can't make changes, but nothing changes in the behavior of what's happening. If there is a network partition problem, if somebody put a backhoe through some data center line, which also happens, you can't control the flag values, but you're still serving the last known good. All right? There is a fallback value encoded into every flag, but we only use it, you only use it, if the client can't initialize. If the moment it stands up, you can't find anywhere to pull the flag rules down from. This is basically, it woke up in an electromagnetically shielded box, and it can't figure out where it is. Then the fallback value is what's going to be served. All right, flag creation and management. So that's the how of the architecture, how we designed our network so that it would be redundant and fast and usable. However, here's how we do flag creation and management. Here's the basic anatomy of a flag. This is the feature flag key. It doesn't show up very well in the slide. That says, so that's the thing that we talked about. It's important to have a name that is meaningful, right? The interesting thing about this is A developer can insert this without having a LaunchDarkly license. There's no reason that you need LaunchDarkly to be able to put LaunchDarkly flags in your code. You need it to be able to control them. But you can put, like, if you have 50 developers and 2 people with a LaunchDarkly license, it works fine. As long as you stick to the style guide and I'll name it the same thing. So this is the feature flag key. And this is the user object. And we call it the user object. We are working to change the name because user object is not big enough. It's basically an evaluation context. So user object could be an IP address, it could be a server, it could be a range, it could be, basically if anything is addressable and can send a response back, it could be a user, right? So user object, what do we call this thing that you want to address? And then this is the fallback value. Like I said, if it wakes up with no kidneys in an electromagnetically shielded box, what's going to happen? Here's your fallback value. Here's some key considerations when you're putting this in your code. The LaunchDarkly client needs to be a singleton called once per SDK key. We've just found that they conflict because they're all trying to do essentially the same thing. We were surprised by this because it didn't occur to us to make it not a singleton. Like obviously it was just gonna, anyway. Users will always surprise you. That's what we learned. Variation calls reference the flag key, so this is what the flag is called, and vary on the user object. So if we have a flag called blink on, and it references me, my context decides whether blink is on or off. User objects provide the attributes that you can target against, and fallback we already talked about. So there are 2 kinds of flags, and I think this is one of the places where people get tripped up, and I think it's super interesting. Long-term flags, we used to call these permanent flags. They're not permanent because nothing is permanent. We had this whole poetic conversation about the nature of permanence in software, and I'm like, we still need COBOL programmers, so maybe there is permanence in software, but what do I know? Strategic flags. These are the ones that I think of as either opsy or extremely businessy, nowhere in the middle. So it's personalization and entitlement. You know that thing where you log into LinkedIn and it bugs you about becoming LinkedIn Pro? That's a personalization setting. It's always going to react that way to you until you buy a Pro membership, and then it bugs you about extending it. I tried it once out of curiosity to see if it would shut up. Pricing tiers, like you're only paying for this many things, we're going to block you here. Geography, you're in a restricted country, you can't have this content. And operations. So if you have a circuit breaker on an inbound something, you want that to be a long-term flag. That's not an experimental flag, that's a permanent flag, a long-term flag. Short-term flags are tactical. They are a question. Short-term flags exist so that we can know something that we didn't know before. So they are things like, I'm putting out a release and I would like to know if it's going to break the world. I think I will do it a little bit at a time. I'm going to do validation testing. I'm going to do experimentation, A/B testing, other kinds of experiments where you try out different ways. Somebody did a really interesting speed test with how does the routing work, these 4 different routes, which one's faster? And so they basically split it among all of these flags and then ran the test to see which one was faster because there were enough nodes that they couldn't predict. I wouldn't have thought of that, but okay. And migration. And those are flags that you are going to pull out afterwards. We'll get into that more later. But it's really important to remember that only long-term flags stay in your code base. Short-term flags need to go away. You have to KonMari those things.
So would a version flag be a shorter or long term?
Depends on what you're using it for. It's probably a long-term flag because, say, if you have an API version flag, you would always want to say, this is only applicable to 2.1 and above.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
So when do flags fit in my process? When do I deal with deploy cadence and technical debt? This is a cool thing. So what we're saying is, when you create a flag, you're holding the idea of the flag in your head. You know what you want it to do, and you may or may not know who you want it to affect, but you know where it's going in the code and what it's doing. At the moment you create a flag, you are in the best position ever to know how to pull it out. And so what we're saying is, you push this flag name, say, I'm making a flag, it doesn't have any targeting, nothing happens, okay? I'm just creating a stub that is a flag. And then, wow, really not showing up. I'm so sorry about that, folks. If the user is this, do the new thing, otherwise do the old thing. Okay, these are the two variations. Right? New thing, old thing. Right? Deploy it with a cleanup branch. So what you're saying is, when you write the flag to do a thing, you also write the code as it will exist after the flag has been proven true. And you git stash the eventual future state of your code while the flag is running and experimenting and proving itself. And then in 30 days or 10 days or automatically triggered, like there's a lot of ways you can do it, you commit the new version that overwrites the code, basically takes the flag out, says, as if it had never existed and I had just shoved this thing into production by typing it in with my fingers, right? There's a process that allows you to do that, and it's going to be faster. And then you never have that moment of like, what was I, how many places did this touch? How was I going to take that out? I mean, let me just say, if when you were talking about a flag you ever used the word and, you've written your flag wrong. Flag does one thing. If you want more than one thing to happen, write more than one flag. Because we've seen so many people get in trouble trying to tie too many things together in a single flag name, and we're like, why didn't you just write 3? Then you wouldn't have had this problem, because like somebody needs the user context for part of it but not the other part, and then they end up in a weird sort of unseelie state of not being able to do either thing. Your flag should never be described with an and. So then, finally, we take this out, we've removed the flag branch, everything goes on as before, except now the new way. We have added a whole bunch of things, little identifiers that pop up and tell you how your flag is behaving. Has it ever been on? Has it been on for a long time? Is it being actively used? Is it a dead end? Nobody has access to this. And then we're going to give you the chance to pull them out. So like, you could set reports on this and stuff and say, hey, look, here are the 30 oldest flags. This is something that we're super proud of called code references. And it finds all the places you connect it to your code repository, usually GitHub, but it also works for GitLab. You connect it to your code repository, it finds all the places that the flag name occurs and highlights them for you and says, you can pull them out. We discussed pulling them out for you, and then we all collectively decided no, we didn't want to touch your code. That's gross and icky. It's a wall. But we can show you where it is, and then you can go in and pull it out. So who gets variants and who manages flags? What's the user? Who's the target? The user is the request context for serving flag variations. Human, machine, address, whatever, it doesn't matter. An addressable context. The user object is all of the attributes that apply. So that's like the cloud of metadata that you have about any object that could be evaluated. So for instance, you might have a way to say, these containers are all the same. Okay, that's That's an addressable attribute. Like all the containers that are older than 14 days, we can address that. So the attribute lets you say this thing is true about what I am addressing. And the primary key, this is the bare minimum. Like everything has a name. Even anonymous users have a name. It's just a hash number. And if we don't have something to address either a user or a group by, it's really hard to deliver the right thing to them. So this is not usually a sticking point. Everybody already has an attribute for addressable objects. So yeah, users could be any of these. If it can send a request and receive a response, it's a user. You can tell we've had a lot of trouble getting that one through. So here's the three components of how this works. So the user object, here's the key, right? This is the one true key that we're using, which again, I said email was a terrible example, and yet here it is. Bob belongs to these groups. If we had a flag that said nobody in gold group can see this, even though Bob is in Google group, he's blocked because he doesn't meet both of those attributes. Everything has to be true for the variant to come through. And then in beta is giving us the details on what he's in. Here's the fallback value. So if this is all, if he's in the beta and he's in these groups and this is his name, then he gets the one-click checkout feature. If any of those are false, he gets the old feature. Yeah? So you can have individual users, but we don't recommend it. We have linkages for, I memorized this wrong, and I apologize, it is not LDAP. SAML. There we go. Like, we'll link to your SAML. Whatever it is that you're using to do user attribute tracking, we'll link to that because there's no point in having more than one source of truth about who your people are. And we use that for external delivery, and we use it for internal so that we can say, you know, people in this security group get access to this. So once you have a grasp on what you want the flag to do, then you're going to figure out who you want to send it to. So you have to have a unique key. Even for anonymous users, you need a session ID or a UUID. And depending on how often you cycle those and how you generate those, if you're doing a percentage-based rollout, we try really hard to consistently deliver. So if somebody is an anonymous user in the first 10% of people to see a feature, we will try very hard to retain that data that they have seen it, so that they don't have the experience of flipping back and forth when the bucket gets re-randomized. So it's not that the bucket gets, it's not like we pick a fresh 20%, it's like the original 10% plus the next 10%, so that you have a consistent user experience. And then these are the built-in attributes, half of which are really a terrible idea. Yeah, see, we're discussing. IP, email, name, avatar, first name, country, like these are just things that we designed because it makes sales demos easier, but it could also be like all sorts of things that we know about people's browsers. You know, we could say if on Internet Explorer, if on Chrome, like anything is possible to put in there. Not anything. Anything that you know. We don't have to know it, but you have to know it. So it depends on what kind of attributes you can provide, how we sort this. Because custom attributes are not provided by us, you need to be sure that you're consistent in how you're calling them internally. And yeah, define custom attributes and then populate them from somewhere else. Segments just let you have a whole group of people that you have defined for quick targeting. We see people actually using Segment to do this, the company, which I think is cool and meta, but it's just me. To quote one of our SEs, a segment larger than Dunbar's number is pretty stupid. Because there are better addressable attributes over like 150 people. But you could individually name a segment of just the IT people at a small company. That might be reasonable. So how do you define your team? Who is the team according to LaunchDarkly? Administrators manage projects, environments, and team members. They say who gets to do what and what the environment looks like. What are these things called? And team members get to manage flags, segments, and targeting. What is this going to go out to do? What's going to happen in my environment that I have control over? And role-based access control says that only people who are allowed to make changes can make changes. We've added a feature that requires you to type the name of the environment that you're changing into a box, which has really reduced the number of times people who thought that they were in test and weren't. If you have to type the word production in order to make a change in production, it helps. I would love to say that was a customer request, but no. So how much? And I'm going to not cover this in the level of detail that I should, but we added this whole new experimentation suite that will help walk you through how to do a statistically valid experiment. Like, how long do you run a test? How many samples do you need for it to be statistically valid? And if you restart a test or change any of the variables in the middle of the test, then you have to start all over, which is a thing that people had been sort of fudging and then ending up with data that wasn't quite great. And by people, I mean the people who were trying to design our front end, like halfway through the experimentation test, changed something. And they're like, but it's better this way. So if you care a lot about experimentation, there's a whole add-on so that we give you richer, higher fidelity data so that you can examine it more and do more with it. So that was a little long, sorry. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I have a bunch of stickers in the back, both LaunchDarkly stickers and stickers from all the other conferences that I go to. And feel free to take what you'd like. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.